There is a moment that the people of Callaway Flats still talk about, even now, even those who were not there to see it with their own eyes. A late September morning, the air carrying that first thin edge of autumn, and a line of wagons stretched from the far end of Granger Street all the way back past the old feed mill, every one of them waiting. The drivers stood with their hats in their hands, not because anyone had asked them to, but because something about the morning seemed to call for that. And at the front of the line stood Nora Voss, 26 years old, her hands roughened to the texture of old rope, a ledger book tucked under one arm, naming a price per pound that was fair when every man in that line had expected her to name one that was not. She had a right to name whatever she pleased. She had the only thing left in 3 counties that could fill a wagon. She set the price low on purpose, and not one of them understood why. And every one of them left owing her something that had no dollar figure attached to it at all. That morning was 3 years in the making. 3 years, 75 acres of river-bottom land that no one wanted, and a truth the Bottoms had been keeping quiet since before Nora Voss was born. 3 years earlier, in the dry April of 1890, the land had gone up at the county assessor's office for back taxes. 75 acres of the Harlan Bottom, wedged between the fork of Cutter Creek and the Mollison River's eastern bend. The assessor, a careful man named Dupree, had described it in the sale register as bottomland, heavily overgrown, prone to seasonal flood, current agricultural value uncertain, which was the polite way of saying that, in the judgment of Callaway County, the parcel was close to worthless. The previous owner had let 4 years of taxes lapse rather than pay to keep it. 2. The standing bid at opening was $75, 75 acres at $1 an acre. Nora sat near the back of the assessor's room with $31 to her name and the deed to her late father's woodlot as collateral. She had been working since her father died 18 months before, washing, mending, taking in boarders 2 at a time in the 4-room house at the edge of town, and she had saved with an almost frightening patience. The woodlot was worth perhaps $90 in a good market. She had spoken to the land office man on the Tuesday before the sale, a conversation that lasted 3 minutes, and come away with a lien arrangement that would let her cover the full 75 if no competing bid came in. If a competing bid came in, she was done. She sat in the back of the room and did not fidget. No competing bid came in. The Harlan Bottom had a reputation. The ride out to the parcel that same afternoon, in a borrowed mule cart, took 40 minutes on a road that was more suggestion than fact. Old Petter Haas rode with her, uninvited and unasked, simply climbing up onto the seat when she turned the cart south out of town. Petter was 68 that year, a Bohemian immigrant who had been farming the flatland northeast of the Mollison for 30 years. He had arrived in Callaway County with nothing but a canvas bag and an opinion about soil, and he had outlasted 4 neighbors and 2 droughts, and the opinion had proved sound. He had known Nora's father. He did not say much on the ride. He watched the land with the patient, specific attention of a man who has learned to read terrain the way other men read a newspaper, looking for what is actually there, not what he expected to find. The Harlan Bottom, when they reached it, was exactly what its reputation promised on the surface. Pigweed choked the high ground in waist-high stands, their thick burgundy stems going woody at the base, the whole mass of them tangled together with lamb's quarter and dock and the occasional pale stalk of giant ragweed. The soil where it showed through was black and heavy, the kind that sticks to a boot sole and adds a pound per step. The creek fork ran low that April, brown and quiet, threading through a stand of cottonwood that had volunteered itself along the bank over some decades and grown quite tall. The smell was river smell, mud and old vegetable matter, and the faint sweetness of cottonwood pollen. Nora stood at the edge of the parcel and looked at it for a long time. 75 acres of weeds, she said, not complaining, simply measuring. Pedder stepped off the cart, walked to the nearest stand of pigweed, and crouched down. He took a handful of soil from beneath the root mass and pressed it between his palms. It crumbled slowly, holding its shape for a moment before releasing. He smelled it. He did it again 12 feet to the left, and then again near the creek edge. He was quiet the whole time. "The old country has a saying," he said at last, brushing his hands clean against his trousers. "The land does not know your name. It only knows what you put into it." Nora looked at the black soil in her own palm. It was heavy and cool. It did not smell like poverty. It smelled like potential that had been left alone too long. What the others saw when they looked at the Harlan bottom was the surface, the weeds, the flood record, the absence of any structure worth naming. What Nora had begun to suspect, over weeks of thinking and a few quiet conversations with Pedder before the sale, was that the bottom's reputation for flooding was also the source of something nobody had thought to account for. Every spring the Mollison rose and laid a thin new coat of silt across the lower acres. It had been doing this for 50 years, maybe more. The weeds had not exhausted this soil. The weeds had been feeding on 50 years of river-delivered fertility, and nobody had ever tried to use it for anything else. The town's verdict on her purchase was not long in forming. By the following week it had hardened into something close to official. At Hamer's Dry Goods, the word was that the Voss girl had taken leave of her senses. At the feed mill, someone said she would have done better to sleep in the street and save the lean. A woman named Clara Fetch, whose husband ran the implement store, stopped Nora outside the post office to express concern, which is to say, to deliver judgment in the softer packaging of worry. "A young woman alone cannot manage river bottom like that," Clara said with the particular kindness that is nearly indistinguishable from contempt. "Not alone, not with no equipment to speak of. You must see that, Nora." Nora looked at her steadily. "I appreciate the thought," she said. That was all. Being right, she had already decided, was going to be its own kind of reply. She moved her bedroll and her cookbox to the bottom in May, sleeping in the lean-to she built against the south-facing bluff at the parcel's edge, close enough to the creek to hear it running at night. She had $31 remaining after the sale costs and the first payment on the lien, and she spent 18 of them in the first month, not on equipment, but on seed, not on grain seed. On vegetable seed, a specific and considered list she had written out over 2 evenings at Pedder's kitchen table. The old man beside her with a cup of bitter coffee, naming varieties he knew from his own decades of working heavy river soil. Sweet corn, adapted to wet feet, pole beans, cucumber, winter squash, and, this was Pedder's particular emphasis, the dark leafy greens that would bolt in thin soil and run riot in rich soil, the ones that would tell her fastest whether her theory about the silt layers was correct. He was treating the whole exercise as an experiment, she realized. He wanted to know, too. The clearing work was the hardest thing she had done in her life, and she had not had an easy life. 6 weeks of it, starting before first light and stopping when she could no longer see, pulling pigweed by the root where it would come and cutting it at the soil line where it would not, hauling the cut mass to burn rows at the parcel edges, watching the smoke rise gray and sweet into the May sky. Her hands went past sore to numb to a kind of permanent ache that she stopped registering. She cleared 12 acres in the first 6 weeks, concentrating on the deep bottom ground closest to the creek, the land that flooded last and drained best. Pedder came on Tuesdays. He never offered to do the work for her. He would look at what she had cleared, test the soil where she had prepped it, and then tell her something specific and useful, where the water would stand longest after a rain, which strip would dry first, where to put the heavy feeders, and where to save the ground for the things that needed better drainage. His advice was so particular and so consistently correct that she came to think of it less as counsel and more as translation. He spoke the language of this specific bottomland, and he was teaching her the vocabulary. She planted the first 8 acres in the second week of June. By the end of June, with 3 inches of rain in the first 2 weeks, and then a dry spell that would have wilted thin soil crops, the signs were exactly what she had hoped. The corn was knee-high when it should have been ankle-high. The bean vines were climbing hard. The greens, the mustard, the collard, the turnip top, had come in so dense she had to thin them twice. And what she pulled for thinning, she cooked for herself over the lean-to-fire and ate with a kind of private satisfaction that bordered on joy. It was working. She told no one in town. She banked it like a coal low under ash, kept it warm, and went back to work. She found the mushrooms in July. She had been following a seep line along the base of the bluff, where the water table showed itself in a strip of perpetual damp, looking for a good site to dig a root cellar, when she noticed the ground was not bare where she had expected bare ground. It was covered in an area roughly 40 feet wide and running some 60 feet along the bluff base, with mushrooms. Not the scattered and unreliable sort that come up after a rain and vanish. These were dense and returning, growing in clear rings and clusters from what she slowly determined, over several evenings of careful looking, was a root network that had established itself in the damp organic matter accumulating at the seep line. Oyster mushrooms on the rotting cottonwood logs along the creek edge. A wide colony of what Petter, when he saw them the following Tuesday, identified with a quiet exclamation as hen of the woods, clustered at the base of a very old white oak 30 feet back from the bluff. Petter sat down on a root and looked at the colony for a moment without speaking. "This has been here a long time," he said. "How long?" "The oak is old, 50 years perhaps. The mushroom grows where the tree allows." "So." He spread his hands. 50 years. The mushroom had been fruiting in the Harlan Bottom since before anyone in Callaway County had thought to look. There is a kind of luck that is not luck at all. It is the reward for being the first person willing to look carefully at something everyone else has written off. Nora Voss had bought 75 acres of what appeared to be worthless pigweed ground, and found inside it 50 years of undisturbed fertility, a seep-fed mushroom colony old enough to have a memory, and 8 acres of the most productive vegetable ground in 3 counties. None of these things were hidden in any mysterious sense. They were simply there, waiting for someone to come looking without the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on their eyes. She dug the root cellar in August in the only way August on the Mollison permitted, which was, to say, brutally. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The creek dropped. The cottonwood leaves went slack and pale. She worked in the early morning and the late afternoon, and spent the middle of the day in the shade of the bluff doing her accounts, which is to say, doing the arithmetic that governed her life. The vegetable ground was producing. She had begun selling to a handful of households, quietly by word of mouth, not in town, but to the farms along the South Road, and she had recovered $9 of her $18 seed investment by mid-August. The mushrooms were not yet in their fall flush, but she had dried a quantity from the July fruiting, and had enough to send a sample wrapped in a cloth with Petter to town, asking him to place it with the cook at the Callaway Hotel, a man from St. Louis named Garrett Holm, with a note asking for his opinion. Garrett Holm's opinion arrived in person on a Thursday morning, walking down the South Road in his hotel apron with the cloth wrapper in one hand and an expression of aggrieved professional excitement on his face. He stood at the edge of the cleared ground and looked at the hen of the woods colony and at the oyster clusters on the creek logs and said, "Miss Voss, where have these been?" as though they had been keeping an appointment and arrived late. She told him what she knew. He said he would take everything she could supply him at a price he named that made her keep her face very still so that she would not show how the number landed on her. It was nearly twice what she had hoped to ask. He also told her something she had not known, that he had been sending to Kansas City for dried mushrooms, paying freight on top of price, for 2 years. That the hotel dining room's Friday mushroom dish had become, by some alchemy of frontier appetite, the most requested item on his menu. That he had been telling guests he could not reliably source fresh. That what she was describing, a reliable returning colony within a mile of his kitchen, was not simply useful, but almost incomprehensibly fortunate, and he was prepared to formalize the arrangement in writing if she was willing. She was willing. She kept her face still all the way through the handshake, and until he had walked back up the road, and then she sat down on a cottonwood log by the creek and let herself feel it for a moment. The arithmetic shifted completely. With the hotel arrangement added to the vegetable sales and the lean payment schedule she had worked out, she was not merely surviving. She was, by the careful measure of her own ledger, going to be all right. By the 3rd week of September, her first full vegetable harvest was in. Corn, squash, pole beans, late greens, cucumbers that had run so furiously over their trellises she had been unable to keep up with the picking and had lost some to oversize. Still, she loaded the cart 4 times in 10 days, driving the South Road farms, selling at prices just below what the town market charged and far better in quality than anything the dry season had left on the upland farms. The drought had arrived in August, not here, not in the bottoms, where the Mollison's water table kept the roots drinking even in the worst of it, but everywhere above the bottom edge, where the corn had gone small and the bean pods had filled poorly and the late gardens had quit. The upland farms were short. It was not a ruinous shortage for most of them, but it was real, and it was the kind of real that makes a person willing to drive a cart to the South Road and buy greens from a young woman who 6 months ago they had called foolish. It was around this time that Hale Drummond appeared. Hale Drummond was the principal produce buyer for Callaway County and 3 surrounding counties, operating out of an office above the grain exchange in the county seat at Fester, 9 miles north. He was a large man with good boots and the kind of confident warmth that has nothing behind it but calculation. He came down the South Road on a fine gray horse in the 2nd week of September, ostensibly to look at the fall harvest prospects in the county, which was his professional reason for any ride he took through farm country. He stopped at the Harlan Bottom because, as he explained it, he had heard something encouraging and wanted to extend congratulations to Miss Voss on what was apparently a productive first season. Nora was splitting firewood when he arrived. She set them all down and waited. Drummond looked over the cleared ground, the loaded root cellar, the mushroom lines she had established along the bluff. He was very good at looking at things and appearing to notice less than he did. He said it was a fine bit of work. He said that a young woman alone had accomplished something worth admiring. He said, and here his voice lowered slightly toward what he imagined was the register of sincere advice, that she ought to think carefully about the next season, because managing this scale of operation without proper market connections was, in his experience, a difficult thing, and he happened to be in a position to simplify matters considerably. He could offer her a standing contract for her full vegetable output, corn, squash, beans, the lot, at a flat rate per bushel, to be established now for the coming 3 seasons. It would give her certainty. It would relieve her of the difficulty of finding her own buyers. He named the flat rate. The flat rate was insultingly low. It was not ignorantly low. It was precisely low, set at a level that would have left her solvent, but never further ahead than solvent, and it presupposed that she did not know what her vegetables had been selling for on the South Road. He had done his arithmetic too. She looked at him without change of expression. "Who told you my per bushel count from last week?" she asked. Something moved briefly in his face and then disappeared. "I don't recall exactly. General word along the road, I imagine." "No one on the South Road farms knew my per bushel count," she said quietly. "I don't publish my accounts. The only person outside this land who knows my numbers is the hotel cook in town." She paused. "And the lien officer." It was the lien officer, of course. A small piece of information passed at a desk. Drummond's name on a private inquiry. A figure relayed, and what the lien officer had probably not understood was a confidence. Drummond's face did not do anything incriminating. He was too practiced for that. But the certainty had gone out of his posture in a way he could not entirely control. "Your offer is below my current market rate," she said, "and my current market rate is below what the shortage will make it worth by spring. I'll continue selling direct. Thank you for the ride down." Drummond left the way he had come, which was to say with good boots and a smile that no longer reached his eyes. Nora watched the gray horse until it was gone around the road's bend, and then she picked up the maul and went back to the firewood. Her hands were steady. She was not angry. She was simply resolved, which is a different and more durable thing than anger. The drought tightened through October. What had been a manageable shortage on the upland farms became, by the 1st of November, a serious one. The late-season corn was in and counted, and the count was poor. The root cellars on the high-ground farms were thin. Callaway Flats began to feel the arithmetic of a short winter, not starvation, not in a county with a working mill and a functioning supply road, but real scarcity, the kind that puts a pressure on families and makes people shorter with each other and longer in their worry. The Harlan Bottom cellar held 3 months of vegetables, sold already in half, and the rest contracted to Garrett Home at the hotel. The mushroom colony had given its fall flush in October, a generous one, and the dried weight was hanging in cloth bags from the cellar's cross beam, adding their dark fungal smell to the root smell of the stored squash and the sweet smell of dried corn. Nora had $22 in her strongbox, and the lien nearly half paid. She did the arithmetic by lamplight in the lean-to on November evenings, cross-checking it the way she always did, running the column twice and then a third time when she wanted to be sure, and each time it said the same quiet thing: she had done it. Not triumphantly, not without cost, but soundly. She had come through the first full season solvent and with reserves, and the land that everyone had called worthless had fed a hotel dining room every Friday for 4 months and supplied greens to a dozen farms through the worst drought in 3 years. It was in this same November that Jess Hartley appeared at the Bottom's edge on a Tuesday morning, which was the day Nora expected Petter and no one else. Jess was 12 years old, the youngest of the Hartley farm children from up on the North Quarter, and he had walked 4 miles in the cold to stand at the edge of the cleared ground and watch Nora work. He did this for 3 Tuesdays before she acknowledged him directly, partly because she wanted to know if he would stay on his own. He stayed. "You want something?" she said at last, on the 4th Tuesday, not unkindly. "I want to know how you got the mushrooms to grow in rows," he said, with the directness of a child who has been rehearsing the question. She told him. She told him about the seep line and the root network, and the inoculation logs she had laid the previous August, cut cottonwood sections laid in the damp at specific intervals, seeded from material scraped from the original colony. She showed him the oyster clusters on the creek logs and explained the logic of them, that the mycelium runs through the wood the way water runs through soil, finding the path of least resistance, and that if you understood the path you could extend it deliberately. Jess listened with his whole body, the way children do when they have found the subject they were meant for. He came back the following Tuesday and the one after that, and by December he was coming 4 days a week, arriving before school and staying until the cold drove him home, and Nora was paying him in vegetables for his family's table. He named the mushroom clusters. She did not ask him to stop. The hen of the woods at the white oak he called Governor. The oyster log nearest the creek he called the Professor. The naming seemed to help him remember them, and they were doing important enough work to deserve names. Petter watched all of this with a satisfaction he expressed only through the quality of his silence, which was the most eloquent silence Nora had ever been around. He had brought her a seedling that first October, a small pawpaw balled in burlap, which he said wanted the bottom ground and the creek moisture and would take 5 years to produce. He planted it himself 20 feet back from the creek in a spot he chose by standing in several locations and looking at the light. He said nothing about it when he was done. Nora understood this as a statement about the future, made in the language of the long-minded, and she was grateful for it. The winter was a working winter. She spent it in a way she had not entirely planned, which was in town, because the bottom work was dormant, and she had something to offer, and the town had a need. The scarcity was real, and she had a cellar. She sold the stored vegetables steadily through January and February at the South Road rate she had held all season, not above it, which she could have done, and she kept a private list of the families whose men had been loudest in their mockery of her purchase, and made a point of charging them nothing different from anyone else. This was not generosity in the showy sense. It was a more demanding thing. It was the refusal to let the mockery matter. It left people with no way to settle the account except internally, which is where it needed to be settled. Clara Fetch came to buy turnips in February. She stood at the door of the lean-to and looked at the cellar's interior, at the hanging mushroom bags and the root bins and the ordered rows of stored squash, and her face did a complicated thing that was not quite shame and not quite admiration, but lived somewhere between the two. "You've done well," she said. "I've done all right," Nora said. That was the whole of her answer, and it was the correct one. Spring came early in 1892. The frost broke in March, and the Mollison ran high with snowmelt from up-country and laid its thin new coat of silt across the lower bottom acres, exactly as it had done every spring for 50 years, depositing the fine-grained fertility that had been building in this ground since before anyone in Callaway County had thought of it as anything but flood-prone waste. Nora walked the bottom the morning after the water receded, reading the land the way Petter had taught her, looking at the color of the silt, the way it lay in the low places, the smell of it. And she felt something she had not quite felt before, which was the sensation of understanding a place well enough to call it hers. Not in the legal sense only, in the earned sense. She planted 12 acres that spring, up from 8. She had spent the winter reading seed catalogs, but also an agricultural bulletin from the State College at Columbia that Petter had produced from somewhere, and a letter she had written and received a reply to from a woman in Missouri who had been growing market vegetables on bottomland for 20 years, and whose practical knowledge was detailed and generous and exactly the kind of thing nobody at the county extension office had thought to collect. Nora was planning now in a way she had not been able to plan the first season, when survival had been the whole of the arithmetic. Now the arithmetic was larger. She had the lien nearly paid. She had the hotel contract for a second year. She had Jess Hartley, who had become, in the way of a naturally gifted child given something real to do, genuinely useful in a way that went beyond the labor. He had a feeling for the mushroom beds that she had not yet fully explained to herself, an instinct for when they were ready, a patience with the work that matched her own. She was paying him actual wages by spring, which was a thing she had been able to do for 3 weeks now, and his father had stopped by once to look at the operation, saying nothing in particular, which Nora understood as its own kind of communication. She was 12 acres, a hotel contract, a proven mushroom colony, and 1 season of vindication into the thing now, and the town had not quite finished its reckoning with her. That reckoning came in September of 1892 in the form of the drought's second year. It was worse this time. The creek dropped to a seep by August 1st, and the upland farms were in genuine distress by the end of that month. Not the polite shortage of the previous fall, but a real failure, the kind that empties a root cellar before Christmas and leaves a farmer going over the same column of numbers looking for a new answer. The county newspaper ran a piece on it in its September edition. Hale Drummond made several appearances along the county roads. his good boots dusty for the first time Nora had seen, his confident warmth considerably thinned, and his own purchase contracts suddenly looking like the kind of certainty that cuts the wrong way. He had locked himself into supply agreements at prices that the shortage had made untenable, and the farmers he had contracted were producing nothing worth delivering. He was in a difficult position, and everyone in the county knew it, because the county was not a large place, and a difficult position makes its own sound. The Harlan Bottom's water table had not dropped. The Mollison was low at the surface, but the ground itself held its moisture at the depth of established roots, and Nora's second-year plantings, deeper rooted, better sited, grown on ground she now knew, had come through August in a condition that she was careful not to talk about in town. She had brought one wagon load to the South Road Farms in late August, quietly, and the response had been something between relief and disbelief. A man named Teeter, whose own corn had come in at a third of normal, had stood looking at her loaded cart without speaking for a moment, and then said, his voice careful and odd, "I said last year you were a fool, Nora. I want you to know I remember that I said it. It was a hard thing to say, and it cost him something, and she respected it. The ground's good," she said. "I was lucky with the ground." She was not, of course, lucky with the ground. She had found it and bought it and cleared it and worked it and learned it, and luck had nothing to do with it. But this was not the moment for that correction. This was the moment for Teeter to buy corn at a fair price and take it home to his family, which he did. By the third week of September, the word had moved through the county in the way that food news moves in a shortage, which is quickly and without any help. The wagons came on their own. She had not advertised. She had not sent word. The need simply knew where the supply was, the way water knows where the low ground is. They came down the South Road and they lined up past the old feed mill, and they stood with their hats in their hands. And Nora stood at the front of the line with her ledger book and named the price she had decided on. It was the South Road price, the same one she had been charging all year, to everyone, since the first season. It was a fair price given her costs, and a fair price given the market. It was not the price the shortage could have supported, which was a great deal higher. It was not Hale Drummond's price, which would have been the shortage price with his own margin added on top. It was the South Road price, and there was not a man or woman in that line who did not understand the difference. Garrett Holm arrived at noon, walking from the hotel, and stood with the others and waited his turn. When he reached the front, he did not conduct business. He simply said, "I want you to know that I told 3 people in Kansas City about this operation last month, and 2 of them wrote to ask me for an introduction." He handed her a letter. She put it in the ledger without reading it. She would read it that evening by lamplight in the lean-to, and the letter would contain an offer from a produce merchant in Kansas City for a commercial supply arrangement at prices that would, when she did the arithmetic 3 times to be sure she was reading it correctly, put the Harlan Bottom on an entirely different footing by the following spring. But she did not know that yet. She was looking at the line of wagons and thinking about the next cart. Hale Drummond arrived at the end of the afternoon. He came on foot, which was unusual, and without the gray horse, which told her something. He stood at the back of the line and waited with everyone else, and when he reached the front, his confident warmth was entirely gone, and there was something in its place that was, if not quite honest, at least less performed. He named a quantity for the produce exchange at Fester. She sold it to him. She charged him the South Road price. He said nothing about the contract offer he had made the previous fall. She said nothing about the lien officer. There was nothing to say. The arithmetic had said it all. Petter came by that evening after the last wagon. He was the only person she had told about the arrangement with Garrett Holm, had told him the previous spring sitting at his kitchen table with the second letter from the hotel cook in her hand, her voice steady, but her eyes bright. Petter had read the letter and set it down and said, in his deliberate way, "The land does not know your name. It only knows what you put into it." He had said it before. He said it again now, standing at the edge of the cleared bottom in the September dusk, looking at the bare ground where the last of the harvest had stood that morning. His voice was the same as it always was, patient, accented, carrying the weight of 30 years of his own faith in this particular truth. Nora stood beside him and looked at the ground. The Mollison was quiet. The cottonwood along the creek edge had gone the first pale yellow of early fall. Governor stood at the base of the white oak, the hen of the woods already putting up a new flush after the rain the week before, its layered fans the color of dark honey in the evening light. The pawpaw Petter had planted 2 years ago had gone tall in the way of a tree that has found its place and knows it, and in another 3 years, perhaps 4, it would give fruit. She had cleared 12 acres of pigweed and made them productive. She had dug a cellar into the bluff and filled it twice. She had found a mushroom colony that had been waiting in the Harlan bottom since before her father was born, and given it someone to tend it who came every morning before school and called the clusters by name. She had bought 75 acres of worthless ground for $1 an acre and proved it was neither worthless nor waste, but rather one of those places the land holds in reserve, the kind of place it keeps patient and undisturbed and covered in weeds, while it waits for the one person willing to look past what a thing appears to be and see what it actually does. Jess Hartley was across the creek, checking the oyster logs one last time before dark, moving quietly the way he had learned to move around the beds. He had found 3 new clusters that afternoon and had come to tell her about them with the specific controlled excitement of a 12-year-old trying to appear professional, which had made her smile in a way she had not shown him. He had a gift for this work. She had been thinking over the past several weeks about the conversation she would need to have with his father about the following season and the season after that, and whether there was a structure that could give the boy a longer stake in the place, something more than wages. That was a question for winter evenings and a carefully prepared argument. She was already planning what she would say. The Harlan bottom went quiet as the light fell. The creek spoke its low-running language over the gravel bars. The cottonwood moved once in the evening wind. Nora looked at it all, her 75 acres, her cellar, her colony, her 12-year-old who was crossing back over the creek now with muddy boots and news about 3 oyster clusters. And she felt the particular fullness that has no better word than abundance, the kind that is not the same thing as wealth, though it can become wealth, but is the prior condition, knowing that the ground beneath you will give back what you have put into it, that the arithmetic is sound, that the thing you were told was nothing has proven itself, quietly and thoroughly, and in its own time, to be everything you believed it could be. The land does not know your name. It only knows what you put into it. She had put everything she had into it. The Harlan bottom had given it back with interest. That was the whole of the arithmetic, and it was more than enough.